Welcome to Kali Trivium podcast. This is the new episode of a series of questions and answer, a Q&A. I had a question that is to say series of questions that merits answering by one of our readers, listeners from England, who took trouble to listening to all of my podcasts, and that this includes, by the way, some of Mihai's, but I technically did all the podcasts, but some of the content were his articles. So if anything merits free Q&A, this is it. So the subject of this Q&A will be the soul. And might I add, a very interesting subject and a very worthwhile subject, which I always address partially here and there, but never as the sole subject of one article or podcast. Now we're gonna do that. So Jimmy Ladd 11 asks a few questions about the soul that can be focused in this simple question about substance. What is soul? But I'll read his questions in entirety, so you have a kind of overview of what we're going to talk about. Quote: I would like to hear about metaphysics of the soul. The soul is a word we use often, yet what exactly is it? I have a vague and nebulous notion of it as this ghost-like copy of myself. Yet I suspect this is woefully naive. It is, but it is not unheard of, Jimmy, as we shall see. Plato specified it was tripartite, and that there is a non-rational aspect of the soul in the form of the appetitive aspect of the tripartite division. Aristotle said there is nutritive and perceptive aspect. Furthermore, there seems to be a distinction between this almost vitalistic force which animates us and then this moral aspect to the soul, such as courage, justice, and then contemplation of forms. By the way, this is Platonic, not Aristotelian view. Does the soul in Christianity admit of a non-rational aspect of the soul? And that would be it. Now we'll distill these questions somewhat. Very important, this Christianity aspect about which Jimmy asks will be, let's say, paradigmatic for my answer. Because Christianity brings something new in the understanding of soul in relation to Plato and Aristotle. Both, by the way, both quotes, both references to Plato and Aristotle in this question are more or less correct, but there is a lot to this tripartite division of the soul in both of them. So division, it's not good to think about it in terms of division, and this is something in division as in parts. Because you have image in your head when you say parts, that soul is something like a cupboard with drawers, but that's how the Greek translates. But when you read Aristotle, you see that this is not so, because Aristotle's understanding of the soul, on which, by the way, I will base my answer to all of these questions, is such that you immediately understand this continuity, the oneness of these aspects, and yet at the same time distinction between them. But let's not go before ourselves. Now let us start from the introductory question. Our reader has a problem of using the term soul, word soul, all the time, but never understanding what it is. Well, this is quite normal for philosophy. There philosophies there, one could argue, especially precisely to answer to such questions. Word soul is used by people who supposedly don't believe in its existence, people who believe only in physical, bodily perceptive system, let's call it like that. Empirists, let's call them, or materialists, which is a rather absurd position taken to its extremes. But they use it, at least in a modern age, for instance, in 19th century philosophy and literature. Term the soul is always on Friedrich Nietzsche's lips, for instance, although he downright denies its existence. There is he calls the soul something in the body. As we shall see, he turns around this traditional notion of the soul, because traditionally body is in the soul, not the other way around, interestingly enough. But he is compelled to talk about soul, to refer to it. And this is a sign of the existence. This is the premonition of existence, of something that is not visible, I would say. That's always like this in philosophy. The other prime example for this is time. When we talk about time, as Augustine said, what is time? When nobody asks me, I surely know. But when somebody poses me a question, I cannot answer. I'm paraphrasing Augustine's statement from his Confessions. So very similar thing. You know that it is, but you don't know what it is. This is how philosophy and metaphysics starts. Now, so this is not. This is to answer to you, Jimmy Lad 11. I don't know what is surname. This is quite normal to ask this question. Jimmy's original notion, which he calls nebulous, is that soul is like a copy of himself, like a shadow. Well, this was the notion. This was the notion of the pre-philosophical, of epic, let's call it, epoch of ancient Greeks. This is Homeric notion, very similar to Homer's understanding of the afterlife, where soul is a kind of shadow, or he calls it shadow. It lives in the underworld and needs to drink the blood of the living beings in order to acquire enough reality to communicate with the living people. This was something that's not unheard of, to think about soul in this way. However, we will work on different assumption, and now my answer proper starts. Soul is not copy of yourself, because you yourself in eminent sense are soul. And what I mean by this, and in eminent sense, means that, well, you are much more than just soul, or you are not only soul, or soul is not. Being soul implies many things. I will work from Aristotle's, Aquinas' understanding of soul, and I have some reasons for that, to call it traditional in general sense. I say this because in Aquinas' understanding of the soul, and there is so-called criticism of Plato, but you always have to understand that by all accounts and in all possibility, Thomas Aquinas only have read for the whole of his life only Timaeus, one Plato's dialogues, because they were not accessible in Middle Ages. I could be wrong about that, but I think at that time, in the mid to late 13th century, Plato's dialogues were not available. By the way, Plato's philosophy is divided between dialogues and his unwritten doctrines. And to understand those unwritten doctrines, sans reading German scholars about the reconstruction of them, I think it's best, my opinion was always, it's best to read Neoplatonists. I always considered Neoplatonism, or with Plotinus, Proclus and others, to be in fact the real Plato's philosophy. I have numerous reasons for that. What I want to say is that Aquinas' criticism of Plato is not criticism of Platonism, because Aquinas' transcendental philosophy is in many ways Platonic philosophy, because Aristotle was mediated to him through Platonizing sources. He used Platonized Aristotle. He was aware of this to an extent, because he was aware, for instance, of the book so-called Liberty Causes, the Book of Causes, that was Arab translation, a reformulation of Proclus Elementatio Theologia, or Stoicheiosis Theologicae, elements of theology, and it was promulgated as being Aristotle's work, but Thomas figured out that that's not Aristotle but Proclus. So this is why I'm saying this. So you have to put things in the context. The other reason is because I think this is paradigmatic for Christian metaphysics of soul. I say metaphysics because there are other ways to look at your own soul, not only metaphysical. Metaphysical understanding is scientific understanding in traditional sense of the word science, but prayer life and spiritual life is something that you maybe don't even need metaphysics for. And if we would to talk about soul from these aspects, that this would be quite a different podcast, but I don't do such podcasts for several various reasons. So to start, I'll propose three definitions of soul that are all three valid, or four, let's say, and I will explain what is soul through them. First, soul is a substantial form of the body. Second, soul is entelecheia. Entelecheia means in Greek being brought to purpose, let's call it a literal translation. Entelecheia is equivalent of energeia. Energeia, or energy, we all know what it is vaguely, but in Greek terms it's something different than today. We'll get back to it. And third, the soul is act of body. Now, all of these three definitions are true and are found in Aristotle and Aquinas, and are found in Neoplatonists, also Platonists, and so on. So I'll try to explain what is soul first by talking about, in fact, most difficult and abstract from this definition, that soul is a substantial form. Now, substantial form, first, let us explain what the form is. Form is, or forma, is translation of the Greek eidos, used by Aristotle. It means form also, and by it, you have to first think about what comes to your mind when you hear form. That something is formal, purely formal. I talk about this a lot. The first impression you'll get, most of you listening to me, is something empty of content. I know because I have it, although I know that soul form is something different. This is the way the modern languages and modern understanding of philosophy is warped, I would even say, or skewed, because it takes things on upside down. Originally, form is the principle of act. Form is the principle of content, not of formality in the sense we understand today. In a word, form is comprehensible reality of something. To have a form means to have logos or ratio, to be comprehensible, to intellect. And this means, for instance, for Thomas Aquinas, this means of I would even be so bold as to say to stand in the light, to be translucent to intellect, because he often uses this qualification of translucency and light, which are not in fact metaphors, because intellect for Aquinas is light, shedding a certain kind of light, created light that makes things, that penetrates things, as light penetrates, for instance, dark room. But never mind that now. So form is something that is actual, something that is principle of actuality. So then what would be substantial form? Substantial form would be the principle or the activity that makes something what it is. So we'll uh, push the definition, or better to say, entangle the definition further. Soul is a substantial form of the body. This means that soul is that which makes body what it is. And what is body? Body in general sense? Well, we are not talking about it. What kind of body we are talking about here? We are talking about human body. Soul is the thing, is the act or activity or principle, but not best to say, that makes body a human body. And what happens then? So if we now proceed to last definition, I'm jumping ahead of my kind of like between these definitions that I listed, because they are convertible in fact, and I use what is most convenient to me at the moment. So soul is the act of body. Now this doesn't mean, obviously, I think it's obvious from what I said, that it's genitive in the sense that body produces soul. Soul is the act of body, meaning that body does not exist as human body when soul is not there. To give you an example from the what Aquinas would say, when the soul leaves the body, when man dies, then the eye, the hand, especially the eye, he likes the example of eye, is not eye anymore. Eyeball, I mean, organ of sight. Why? Because it doesn't have purpose that it had. It's I only in the sense of equivocal sense. This means that it can be compared by some accidental principle to a living, real, living and seeing eye. So the soul is the form in this sense, and as you see, soul is act. Soul is the life of body in an eminent sense. But you have to understand this. Now we have to move further. Soul is also Energeia and Energeia. Just to give you perspective, because saying this kind of makes you feel that soul and body, that this relationship to body is the most important thing in soul. I'm not sure it is, because there are other things in soul that in Middle Ages and antiquity people didn't really consider that much, because I think they were understood as something that is self-explanatory, and this what I mean is ancestry and such things. Even this ethnic identity, I do believe that it is something that can be subsumed under this. But Thomas, or somebody like Thomas, would subsume it under this relation to body, to reality, that can have existence in this mutable world of change, and so on and so forth. Soul is what all these things kind of go under the moniker, or under the umbrella of body, I would say. However, soul as entelechia means the same as soul as substantial form. But what is entelechia? Entelechia is the pure energy, qualifiedly pure, because energy that is pure in absolute sense, only such energy is God. Energy means, in Aristotle and Aquinas, energy, or actus, actualitas, means reality. That is to say something that is opposed to possibility, in the sense that you have possible or potential existence, that is not the primary existence, but is necessarily dependent on actuality. For instance, you have the famous example of Aristotle. You have an acorn and you have an oak. Oak is contained in acorn as a possibility. And it's very interesting. We don't think like this today. And this is, I think, a natural way of thinking. But this means that potentially, when he say that acorn, that oak tree potentially exists in acorn, he means exists. He doesn't mean you can imagine it as existing. It does exist. It's hard to wrap your mind around sometimes. But this existence is possible. This possible existence is made possible by act. By an act is actual oak. This is oak tree in energy. So this is what this Energeia is. But as opposed to oak trees, soul as Energeia is pure, self-subsistent, subsistent Energeia. This means that it can exist uh, independently of matter. This is very important. So it doesn't need matter to exist. This means, in the sense of soul, that soul is a substantial form of the body, is an act of the body, but is also independent of the body in some sense. And this is sometimes very hard to understand when you talk about Aristotle and Aquinas and this tradition. But I think it's necessary to understand, because with they identifying this identity of body and soul that's at work with them, it's something that is very natural to human beings. I think they pinpointed exactly how things are, because the idea of kind of separation, radical separation of soul and body, which was not something that Plato did, by the way, despite later criticism, I'm not convinced, is a modern way of kind of like dividing this thinking, willing, emoting substance from itself. It's something that makes a kind of like division in a thing, in a human being that should be one. And then you are in position, for instance, of maybe a radical asceticism as opposed to maybe radical debauchery. You don't have this, what I want to say, you don't have this natural, kind of like natural reality of our own way of existing as being ensouled. In this way, however, this, for instance, Nietzsche's criticism of the idea that soul is something opposed to the body and so on, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is something that completely ignores Catholic tradition, for instance, Aristotelian tradition. He takes kind of like this Plato, his understanding of Plato, from, I would say, even in direct polemics with, albeit not using the title, with Dialogue Phaedo, in his chapter on the body in Zarathustra. He would not be able to say, for instance, that soul always tries to lay down the body to make it weaker, to suck its lifeblood and so on. This is not true. This would be because in original notion they are one. And now I digressed. I'm sorry. Now to return, what this means, that it is one with the body, but it is also separate, can be separated from the body, and indeed will be separated in that. Well, this human being is one being, and what makes it one being is his soul, because soul, as I said, as an act of body, is the purpose of the body and purpose of every organ in the body. So when there is no soul, those organs all lose their purpose. This is how we must think about soul. And we must think about soul as not being in the body, but body being in the soul. Similarly, like when you thinking about somebody is in your thoughts. In and out, inside and outside, are in traditional philosophy, especially in Middle Ages, understood in this way. This is how you have to think about inside, intrinsic, extrinsic, and so on, because this is how they thought, not primarily in spatial terms, but in terms of the relation of intellectual mode of existence or let's say even spiritual and material. Yeah. So there are, however, acts of human beings that are not bodily, that are not corporeal, and these are intellectual acts. And intellect, by the way, is the higher one of these higher powers of the soul. And how powers of the soul have to be understood in a sense that they are hierarchical, because in this way of thinking everything is hierarchical, and this is why the soul can be one with the body but also separate from it, because it is the principle of the body. It is as a purpose and as a cause before the body. Body cannot exist without soul, but soul can exist without body, for the main reason being is that it has powers that don't need body for the existence, and this power is intellect. And intellect, as this higher power, encompasses all other powers. This is very important to understand. These things are never separated. This is not the way of thinking that separates, divides. This is the way of thinking that unifies. So soul can also survive the existence, the demise of the body. It's very interesting. I cannot really go into this. It would be too long of digression. For instance, when Thomas Aquinas explains how in soul surviving the body, the memory remains, and in things that man taught through his life and lived through his life, how they remain in the soul in not in a corporeal way of corporeal memory, but different kind of memory, because everything that enters cognition, in a way, intellect, starts to exist in intellectual mode. And this is very interesting thing, how he speculates how you think when you die. Well, maybe that would be other story for some other occasion. So being Energeia means being free from this. In fact, being means being subsistent. Subsistence means being capable of assimilating opposites without being destroyed by them. And in intellect, you can think as opposite things that in reality nullify each other. But think without problems, think them at the same time. Also, the object of intellect can be infinitely intense, and this doesn't ruin intellect, as Aquinas would say. When your eye sees too strong a light, which is a proper object of sight, the eye is destroyed. Intellect the more intense its object is, the more comprehensible, the stronger the intellect becomes. This is because, as Aquinas would say, intellect is not material, so it cannot be destroyed. Immaterial things cannot be destroyed. The powers of the soul, vegetative power and instinctive powers, nutritive powers, and so on, are lower. They are something that animals also have, because animals also have souls. Soul, from the whole thing now, I was talking about human soul, which is a proper way, as I say, because this is hierarchical metaphysics. You always have to start from the highest point. And highest point in this visible world, which steps out of the visible world, is human soul. And therefore Aquinas calls it a horizon. That is to say, as horizon is a dividing line between heaven and earth, so is the soul, because the soul is the first, human soul, intellective soul, is the first immaterial being existing in this world. But it is the last from the immaterial beings existing in the world at large, because you have angels before it, before and above it, and so on and so forth. So where was I? Yes. So lower kind of this lower powers are all powers of the one soul. And animals have them in the sense that they have souls that have only these lower powers, and therefore animals are not immortal, for instance, because they cannot. Those are powers that are completely dependent on the body. They are purpose of the body, nothing more. Soul, the human soul, has this higher purpose. There's intellective function, or power, let's call it, which encompasses everything else. It encompasses emotions and other things. Intellect is very, very wide encompassing term in traditional philosophy, and it has a bad rap today, I guess. After sexual revolution, any kind of intellectuality was made to be understood as something that is practically castrating the human being, which is absolute opposite. This comes after psychoanalysis and such ideas, which are completely anti-traditional. So, what we have here is what the soul would be, and I will conclude with the coup de grace of metaphysics, where this can be put in wider context, and this is the notion of the act of being, actus essendi. What is this? Well, act of being. To have an act of being means to be, in a full sense of the word. You can exist, as I said, as a possibility, but possibility exists only insofar there is something actual. And this actual, Thomas Aquinas, this actuality, the real actuality, Thomas Aquinas calls act of being. Act of being means that if you are a man, you exist as a man. You are not simply an idea of man or a kind of possibility of becoming a man. Today, there is this idea that you can, for instance, that there is this evolution of animals into higher forms of animals. In Aquinas, this is something impossible, because act of being is something that is unique to every being. Act of being is what makes you do and act to fulfill your purpose of existence, what makes you real. And this act of being is mediated by form. As we said, form is soul is the substantial form of the body. Therefore, soul is what gives act of being to human being, and this means makes it human. To be a human being, you have to act humanly, not in sense of moral sense, but act, exist. To exist means to act. To be means to act. To be an energy. To be in some kind of activity, or kind of like very. This is something that you simply have to explain in metaphors, or for something. I would even say the act of being is kind of like radiance of things, or affluence of things that makes them moving, living, thinking. This is being in act, or having an actus essendi. But actus essendi comes through form. It is its formal cause. This means that form is what circumscribes matter, what makes matter what it is. Human body is a matter, what is called prime matter. Prime matter, materia prima, in scholastics is its original, one of few meanings, but original meaning is what makes something this that it is. What in fact accepts this form, that an act of being, that through it makes thing precisely what this thing is. For instance, there is we could say that prime matter is a human matter for humans. Materia signata, on the other hand, is a matter of this concrete individual, so my materia signata would be my personal bones, sinews, blood, and so on and so forth. So, act of being is what makes this matter and form one, what makes man one man, and what makes man one being, and not being that is composed from two beings. And this is very important, and this is what I will conclude with. And this is very important because in Thomas Aquinas' times there were ideas that there are many souls, many forms that build one atop another. For instance, you have this vegetative soul that we share with plants. There is this instinctive soul which we share with animals, and in human that they are not they are one soul, another second soul, third soul, and they are the human is kind of like some of these souls. Aquinas say with complete right, his transcendental principle: the one and being are convertible. So you have one being, you have being. You can have two substantial forms in one being. You see, it has to be one substantial form. So it has to be one soul with different powers, virtus, as he would say. And by the way, the word virtuality comes from this. Virtuality means existence in power. Anyways, you know why is this important? Because in this way he separates completely Catholic metaphysics, transcendental philosophy from any kind of evolutionary notions. Because it has to be one as it is. It cannot come to exist from the development of different parts, and it cannot be resolved in different parts. By the way, think about transhumanism now, where you have the idea that you can at will separate different functions of human being. Maybe some reject, some keep and update or perfect in a material sense of the word. This is impossible in Aquinas or traditional notion, and it is, I would say, indeed impossible in reality, but you can have illusion that you can do this, that you can upgrade human being. But this idea of upgrading the human being is based upon notion that there is no principle of unity in human being, that human being is not one being, but like computer, like PC, it's a system of parts, and purpose can be changed, or it can be repurposed. As we say in original notion, soul as a purpose cannot be changed. It is a given purpose, and it makes everything one, and nothing can be taken from it without pain, because our soul feels the pain of the body. It is dependent on the body, but it is not dependent essentially that it cannot exist without it, but accidentally that it is proportioned, let's say, to it. So this would be, I think, relatively satisfactory answer to this question of our reader. Any additional questions, of course, I can answer in comment section. Thank you for your attention. This is Branko Malic, College Tribune, signing out.